Hello everybody, I'm Mr. Zinzin. Today I tell you the most thrilling and horrorest stories. Please subscribe, share and enjoy. This is a very minor event that occurred last week, but I need to give a, slightly long, backstory so that you can understand my reaction to the event that occurred with my almost 1.5-year-old daughter. I purchased my very first home on October 16 of 2015. I fell in love with my house the first time I saw the photos of it online and was instantly drawn to it. The price was way under budget and it was exactly what my little family needed as it was newly remodeled. I didn't want to purchase a fixer-upper because I just had my first child in January of 2015 and we just didn't have the time or the ability to have to be putting together a house while taking care of an infant. We couldn't be tearing up the floors which are her stomping grounds or painting with hazardous fumes etc. But as I said, none of that was necessary. I found my dream house. Upon the initial walkthrough there were no issues. I didn't feel anything. Mind you, I haven't been very sensitive I would say for the last 2-3 years, though most of my teenage years into my early 20s I was. I could sense when there was something just beyond the eyes reach and sometimes I even saw things. Well, thankfully nothing was off for me. I put in an offer at asking price and a couple weeks later we closed on the house. The west side of Jacksonville is considered to be a bad part of Jacksonville, but honestly all of Jacksonville has its bad parts. My side of the road I live on is pretty normal middle class folks. About 2 miles down my road on the other end not so good. But, the kinds of criminal activity we have are generally isolated situations. If someone is shot, it's usually drug or gang related. If someone is assaulted it's usually domestic violence and they knew their assailant personally. What I am getting at is, if you are involved in illegal activities you will be more likely to be a victim of crime in a not so good part of town. If you mind your business and you're just a family living, generally you don't have an issue. There are always robberies and crazy folks and one-offs here and there of course. Innocent people are not safe just because they mind their own business. I am just saying that the more into those kinds of things that you are, the more likely it is that you will find yourself in some trouble. We have a friend that is a JSO, Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, 911 dispatcher, and we had him review the calls for the last 6 months in our zone and he was able to tell us that there was nothing serious or recurring issues that we should be concerned with, home burglaries, carjacking etc. We felt comfortable with our decision. Shortly after moving in though we learned of a suicide by cop incident on our street. At my house. One of the neighbors came to the front of the house where my husband was outside checking the mail or something. He asked if we were kin to Mike. He of course said no, we purchased the home from the previous family but we were of no relation. He went on to explain that Mike perished right here in our front yard under the beautiful old shady tree we loved so much. He said that he was a very nice man whose only flaw was his love of beer. I purchased the house from a woman in her mid-30s who was living there with her husband and 4 kids taking care of her cancer-ridden mother. The place was much too small for them, but she moved in with her mom after her father died last year to help take care of her. I didn't ask her, "Hey, how did your dad die? Did he die here?" Like, it didn't even dawn on me A, to ask how or B, to ask if it was here. Just common courtesy you know? But I was thinking, more along the lines of natural causes, not right outside the front door. Well, I was wrong. We always joked the first week that the only thing our house was missing was a white picket fence. Well, turns out we had one before the SWAT team broke it down a year before. Apparently, according to news stories online, Mike called the police, told them he had a gun and he was going to hurt himself and others. He said, "Send the SWAT team, I want to get killed." When the cops pulled up, he went inside and came out with a gun. He pointed it at the cops and they shot and killed him on the spot. Did I buy a haunted house? First thing that crossed my mind. But I hadn't and still have yet to feel anything in the house. So, I am under the impression that though it was sudden, the man was ready to go. We came to realize that the NASCAR posters and Bikini Woman poster, and the crushed beer cans in the walls of the shed in the backyard must have been his things. Probably why the daughter didn't take those things down and kind of just left them. I can tell that it was his man cave. If anything, I get creepy vibes from the shed. Going in there at night, peering into it will make my skin prickle, and it feels like someone is in there looking at me. It's not evil feeling, but there is definitely a presence in there of some kind, and it's very strong. Strong to the point that my aunt came over the beginning of May, and that woman has more experiences than I have ever had and much creepier, and she said, "Come here." We were sitting in the backyard and the sun went down. She was calling me to the back corner of my yard where the shed is. She said, "Stand right here." As I did, I felt a coolness wrap around my legs and work itself up my body. I didn't say anything, I just looked at her. She said, "You feel that? You feel the cold?" "I have goosebumps." She said, "It's coming from there," pointing at the shed that we were standing about 10 feet from. She said, "He's not bad, but he's there. And that's okay." At which point, I told her about Mike. Ugh. So I'm not the only one that feels the vibes from the shed. This was my first confirmation of him, but this is about my baby girl. End of last week, I was deep cleaning my car. She needed it bad. My husband was trying to cook dinner though, and so I took the baby out with me. It was early evening, about 6:30-ish. The sun was still out. With daylight savings it's really not pitch black out until about 9 p.m. these days. I love it. I rolled all the windows down in the car and opened all the doors. I have a Dodge Caliber which sits pretty low to the ground. I sat Punky, her nickname, in the passenger seat and began sweeping out the car while she entertained herself with a random shoe of hers and the oak cord that she found. She was happy to be out in the car where she could observe outside, as we never did this before. Hence the state of my car. Well, my car was pulled up practically to the front door facing it, top of my driveway. To the right of the car, if you're facing the house sitting in the passenger seat, is grass and the big shady tree, and the other half of my front yard. Half is the paved driveway, half is grass and the big old tree. My neighbor in the house on the other side of the grass wasn't out this evening. I'm used to seeing him and his children out playing basketball, but apparently they were in for the night. The street had a beautiful breeze, but there were not many people out at all except across the street, parallel to us behind my car, there were 2 men sitting in lawn chairs. Punky can't see them. Now, Punky is the friendliest little girl you will ever meet. She is a bully to her 12-year-old stepbrother, but she's truly a sweet girl. I love her to pieces. But man, oh man, did she freak me out. She looks out the door to the tree directly in her sight and I hear her say hi. And she starts waving. This is one of the few words she knows besides thank you, thank you, mama, dada, Daisy, JC her brother, Chesh, Lush's milk in Spanish, and how she lets us know she is hungry, just to name a few. She always waves and says hi to people when we are out and about, and if they wave back she loves it and starts laughing and gets more into it. If they don't wave back she just kind of stays there with her little hand up, and I immediately say, "Hi Punky." Because I feel so bad they leave her hanging. Well, she says, "Hi." Again and looks back at me smiling and excited. I am sitting in the driver's seat wiping my door down, and she's laughing and smiling at me because she obviously made a new friend. I look out her door to see who she's waving at, expecting to see my neighbor's kids, and there is no one there. It slowly dawns on me, she's waving at the tree. And apparently it's waving back based on her reaction. I am not sure if she saw Mr. Mike there waving at her. But I know my daughter generally doesn't wave at inanimate objects. There was no one outside in her line of vision and she was staring very intently at the tree. I think she may have seen him. Needless to say, she freaked Mama out a little bit. I was originally going to post the story, but in the Google search bar I just typed in his first and last name and my street name and there was a link with my entire home address, and that may not be the wisest information to give out. My apologies. Thanks for reading. One afternoon in 2003, my 8-year-old daughter was playing with her dolls out on our front porch when suddenly a young girl around the age of 15 years old was standing in front of her. My daughter looked up, asked her what she wanted, and the girl replied, "I want you to come with me to a place where it is much more fun than here." Then my daughter Danelle realized she was a stranger and had no way of getting to our front porch, because she would need to go through the front gate, which is always locked for security reasons. Then she looked at the girl's feet and saw that she was floating about 6 inches from the ground. Scared, she said no and stood up to run into the house through the front door. The stranger grabbed my daughter's arm and tried pulling her away from the front door when my daughter Danelle, with force, got away from her grasp. When she ran into the house, she suddenly stopped when seeing her younger siblings and myself sitting on the sofa reading a book. I asked her what was wrong and she said nothing, but I could see the terror in her eyes. I asked her again and said it is okay to tell mommy. Then she told me what happened. My reply was, Danelle, don't make up a story like that, you are scaring your sisters. Then she said with an adamant tone, I'm not making up a story, Mom. Look. She showed me her arm and there was a faint bruise-like figure of a hand on her arm, like someone grabbing it and pulling hard. Till this day we don't know who that young girl might be, and she never again appeared to Danelle. To this day, I'm not sure if I've been able to project my nightmare straight into my room as I awaken while I am coherent enough to talk to anyone who may be with me nearby, or I actually saw ghosts in my childhood home, but what I saw and heard felt so real. When I was really little, my parents would let me sleep with them in their room, and I really appreciated that, because on the nights when they wanted their alone time and I was banished to my room, I was never able to sleep soundly. On several occasions I would wake up and see a man hovering over me with a knife as if I was about to be filleted right there in my bed. Of course I would proceed to run to my parents' room hysterical and pound on their door until I was allowed entry. And the number of men would multiply some nights. My room would be filled with violent-looking people. My dad started getting frustrated with me and wanted to prove to me that none of it was real, so he came to my room to sleep and protect me like a nurturing father would do. That night I woke up and instead of men preparing to kill me, I saw 2 women in the corner of my room. They would look at me and then converse with each other in a language I didn't understand. I woke my dad up and pointed in the direction I was seeing the women, and to my utter dismay he saw nothing. But they still would not go away. I tried to describe what I was hearing, and the women at this point were paying me no mind. He never did see them, and I'm sure he was just thinking kids have the craziest imaginations. I still feel like there were multiple presences in the house, with the center of activity being in my room. Mind you, I was probably 7 or 8 at the time, so it could have been imagined, or it could have been that special sensitivity to the paranormal that children are said to have. I guess I'll never know. I am really telling the truth. This is really seeming weird to me, since I never had these kind of emotions. If you had something similar, please tell me, because I'm really scared. One night I was sleeping with my 2 sisters. It was a Friday night, and we decided to stay up. We started talking about scary ghosts and movies and all that, and suddenly I felt super sleepy. Then I told them to turn the light off and go to sleep. I had a peaceful night until somehow in my mind I saw this little girl saying, "Play with me. Play with me." I shot up awake in my bed. I checked, my sisters were deep asleep. And then I glanced at the open window. There was the girl exactly the way I saw in my dreams. I quickly checked my aunt and uncle. They sleep in the same room as me. I thought it was my imagination, and I kept saying that to myself. I soon fell asleep again. In the morning while I was having breakfast, my aunt said to me, "Why were you crying last night?" I suddenly felt a chill. She told me that I was crying, and when she asked me why I was crying while I was sleeping, she told me that I mumbled something under my breath and I went to sleep again. I will tell my next weird thing in my next experience. I never told my mom about the girl, since I thought it was my imagination. Anyone had something similar? I would like to hear. I'm really scared about that night though. Please give me some advice. That time I was little and kept thinking it was only imagination. I thank this website to tell my experience. Love. Scary Home 234. When I was a small child I had many imaginary friends. One was named Moro, another was named Friday. But they were not weird at all because I knew that they were not real. There was one named Debbie that scared me to death, and I thought she was as real as the day is blue. During my younger childhood we moved around a lot because my parents never really liked to stay in one spot. There was this one house where we stayed where I remember had the most activity. Well, the spirit named Debbie used to follow me around everywhere and scare the hell out of me. The first time she showed up was in a friend of my mom's house. I was playing with my toys in another room while they played my mom's friends. Her name is Crystal. Boyfriends, Jermaine, PlayStation. The story goes that I ran into the room they were playing in and started screaming, "Debbie! Stop!" No. I was in tears. Jermaine went and checked the whole house and said that no one was there. Another time I was at my grandparents' house. I wouldn't call it a house but a mansion. I was sitting on the couch with my mother watching TV. When I started screaming, "Debbie, stop! I don't want to play." This happened many times after until my mom got tired of this and screamed over my sobs, "Debbie, I don't know who you are or what you are, but you're dead. Leave my kid alone." It all stopped. No more screaming. No more crying. No more Debbie. That house was very creepy and was full of stuff that was unexplainable. My mom said she would wake up every morning at 5 a.m. and stare that hallway where my room was. She felt that if she stared down there, whatever it was that was trying to walk down the hallway would stop. In the basement of the house, where my uncle slept, we would get a very depressing, sad, and uneasy feeling. We did some later research about the house and found out that the lady who lived there before us had a husband who died of cardiac arrest in the hallway where my mom used to stare down. Turns out he was very abusive towards his wife, so she might have felt the spirit was evil. I need to know if Debbie was really there. More to come. When I was about 4 years old, I lived in a house owned by my grandfather. It was a small house, 2 bedrooms. And my little sister had just been born. I had a best friend, his name was Brett. He was 2 years older than me. Him and I often played in the front yard of that house, and since the entire property was fenced off, we didn't need to be watched. My father made me a playhouse out front. It was fun to play in, the 3 of us. There was this girl who used to play with Brett and I, her name was Emma. Emma was the same age as Brett, with blonde hair and bright blue eyes. She always wore a green dress and black dress shoes. I told my mother about Emma, and she thought she was just an imaginary friend. She often would watch Brett and I play outside, and she never saw her. I saw Emma and talked to her all the time, until I moved away. My father and grandfather got into a fight, and my grandfather kicked us out. I never saw Emma after that, except once. That's a different story. My grandfather burned down my little playhouse, and I cried. It was the only place Emma liked to be in. I never told her I was leaving. I thought she would be mad at me for having to leave. She got mad when Brett needed to move away. A few years later, my father was cleaning out a warehouse across from that old house. He found a newspaper, which I no longer have. On the newspaper, it talked about a drive-by shooting of a young girl. She died while waiting for paramedics. Her name was Emma, and there was a picture of her. Blonde hair, and bright eyes, and her little green dress she always wore. This story is sort of a continuation of my previous story, Family Connections. I had talked about some very similar but separate experiences that my grandmother, her brother, and my mother had all had about 30-40 years ago. I am sort of remembering things from my childhood as I write these stories, so I will share at least one that I remember vividly. But the main point of sharing this time is to let everyone know some of my sister's experiences. When I was about 5 or 6, we were in the process of building a house. We had been living in Louisiana when my sister was born and moved back when she was probably about a year old. We lived in an apartment that my great-grandmother rented out, then we rented a smaller house for a little while before buying the property that my parents were going to build their house on. After we bought the land, we moved in with my grandparents, Mom's parents. My sister is about 2 years younger than me, so all this moving and renting took place over about 2-3 years, give or take, so she was about 3 or 4 during this time. I think we lived with my grandparents close to a year or so while we built the house. During this time, we stayed in their basement. Just to give a brief description of the house, when you walk in the front door you're in an open foyer with an open living room to the left and the doorway to the kitchen on the right. Directly in front of you are two sets of stairs, one going upstairs and one going downstairs, similar to a split level, just a little more room in the foyer than some I have been in. When you walk downstairs to the basement there is a hallway. On the right at the very end is a full bathroom, and perpendicular to the door going into the bathroom is a small bedroom. At the very end on the opposite side is a larger room that my parents used as their bedroom. At the time were double glass sliding doors that went out into the backyard. My sister and I shared a smaller bedroom, and we had a full-size bed and a twin bed in there, so we got to sleep in our own beds. This only happened a couple of times to me, but I woke up one morning and saw people standing around my bed. They were dressed in what we would call black tie attire and were all talking to each other, like they were at a party. The only one I remember clearly was a woman with dark hair wearing a red dress. I wasn't afraid, in fact, I thought it was pretty neat that I got to see them. I told my mom about it, but I don't remember what she said about it. It must not have been that important, especially when I told her I wasn't afraid. But that was it. Like I said, it only happened once or twice that I remember. Now, my sister's experiences are a little more strange than mine. We moved into our house and nothing unusual happened that I recall. So flash forward about 3 or 4 years. We were moving, again. This time, we had bought a chicken farm with a house already on it. I was about 9 and my sister was about 7. The house and property were both not very well taken care of. The couple we bought it from were both older and the wife was in poor health. She was also pretty close to being a hoarder. She didn't throw anything away, she didn't keep things very clean, and I think the husband was just tired, so he didn't do a whole lot on the property to keep it clean or anything. Needless to say, this house was absolutely filthy when we moved in. My sister and I were so afraid to sleep by ourselves for the first couple of weeks, so we slept on a mattress in my parents' bedroom. We eventually graduated to a hideaway bed in the living room. I'm not exactly sure why we were scared. I think maybe just because it was a new house, we weren't able to move a lot of our furniture in for a couple of months because this woman pretty much refused to get her stuff out of there, and it was just dirty. Finally, we started getting settled in and moved our furniture in and were actually able to sleep in our own rooms. This house was long, and mine and my sister's bedrooms were on the opposite side of the house than my parents' room. Mine and my sister's rooms were directly across the hall from each other, so we would lay in bed and talk across the hall at night sometimes. I don't really know the exact time or age, maybe about a year or 2 after we had been living there. We were when this started, but my sister, we'll call her Mel, yelled for my parents to come to her room one night. This was when we actually had a bedtime and went to bed early, and my parents stayed up for a little bit. Miserable childhood lol. My parents were in the living room, which was down the hall from our rooms, so not hard to hear us. Of course by this time I'm awake and I'm pretty nosy, so I went in her room too. She told us that there was a man standing at the end of her bed. She said he was very tall and was wearing a long robe and had a long sword that he was holding straight up and down in front of him. It sounded to me like someone who was holding a sword and keeping watch, if that makes sense. Neither I nor my parents could see him, but she kept insisting that he was there, even when we were in the room with her. She told us she wasn't scared, so my parents told her maybe it was her guardian angel. And that was that. She never really talked about him much, but I think she saw him in her room for a while after that. Around this same time, or maybe even a year after she first saw her guardian angel, Mel started telling me that sometimes at night she would hear people whispering and talking to each other. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but she said they would start hissing at each other and eventually the whole conversation would end with a loud scream. She said this happened a lot and she eventually told my mom about it. Mom wasn't sure what to say, so she just told her to pray when she heard the noises. Mel didn't say much about this again after that, but I think she heard things for a while, too. We lived there for about 12 years, and there were a couple of other things that happened that couldn't really be explained, but that's another story. In all the time we did live there, I don't think that I experienced anything like that. I don't remember seeing anything, but I did hear some things. But, that's another story, too. I think this is way too long as it is. When my grandfather was a boy growing up in Fiji in the mid-late 1950s, he and his siblings experienced some strange occurrences on our family land. They lived in a one-story house on the estate, and every day they had to go down to the river to get buckets of fresh water. Every now and then my grandpa would hear these odd slurping noises coming from the kitchen area which were keeping him awake at night. He tried to convince his older brothers to go see what the sound was, but they were already sleeping and just told him to ignore it or go away. So one night he plucked up the courage to go see what it was. He told me that hunched over one of the buckets on the kitchen bench was the shadowy figure of a small child, so dark it was practically black. In fact, all he could really see of it was the whites of its eyes and teeth. It stopped drinking, looked at him, smiled and ran off. He told me he followed it outside just in time to see it scurry under the house, so he got on his hands and knees and crawled after it, but once he was there it had disappeared. He said he was under there for a while lifting up chickens looking for this thing, but it was gone. But that was not the last time he would see it. A couple of nights later he was drifting off to sleep and looking at the big tree just outside his window when he noticed something on one of the branches moving in an unnatural way. His eyes strained in the darkness trying to make out what it was when he realized it was the thing. The small figure from the other night. He darted out of bed and into his parents' room in such a panic they could barely make sense of his words. That continued for weeks, he told me so. Eventually his parents were forced to move one of his brothers into his room in hopes to ease his imagination. It worked. For a little while. One night as he was on the brink of sleep he heard his little brother call out to him. He rolled over to see him, eyes wide and frozen, just staring out the window. He followed his gaze up the tree and right to the little dark figure sitting on the branch just looking down at them with such a big white smile it almost took up half its face. They stayed awake that night, afraid to move, just looking back at the black figure and its glowing white teeth and eyes. The following morning they begged their parents and siblings to believe them, but they just assumed it was a nightmare. As my grandpa and his brother got ready for bed that night they decided to sleep in the same bed because they were both so scared. He told me he awoke to his younger brother shaking his arm and calling his name again, but when he looked up, the black figure had moved closer to the window. Unblinking and still smiling down at them, it dived off the branch, into their window, coming right for them. It engulfed them in the room in complete darkness. He says he doesn't remember what happened after that, but the next morning he climbed up the tree and hung a rosary on the branch. He said neither him or his brother ever seen it again. To this day the lot of them still refuse to walk past cemeteries or big old houses at night. It's actually quite cute and funny, but I would do the same if I were them. This is a story my mother told me after the strange incidents that happened in my old room. As mentioned in my previous post, I live in a 3-story heritage house in Sydney, Australia. It's old and almost every member of my family has lived here at one point or another, and they all have their own stories about it. This one takes place in the early 1990s. After my mother brought me back from the hospital she hardly ever put me down. By the time my dad got me a crib and she laid me in it I immediately started to cry, but I'd stop as soon as she'd pick me up. No one thought anything of it at the time because I had spent the majority of my newborn life always in someone's arms, so my father and her would just let me fall to sleep in their bed before they moved me back to my crib. But I would always end up crying and trying to move. My mom says that my cries were filled with so much fear and terror she couldn't bear to leave me in my cot, so from then on I slept with them. That continued until my dad got extremely annoyed and demanded my mom put me back into my own bed. As my mom got to her feet and walked over to my crib she seen the vague outline of a small body, no bigger than 4 feet, sitting in the corner of the crib. She looked back at my dad in shock, but when she turned around it was gone. Thinking it was just a shadow or trick of the mind, they were a tad sleep deprived, she laid me down in my crib and went back to sleep. That was the first quiet sleep they had in weeks. At 2 a.m. she woke for some reason. She checked on me and there was no sign of a shadow or distress. She went to the bathroom, but she felt like someone was watching her, so she leaned out the door just to check if anyone else was up, and sitting there on the bottom step of the staircase leading up to what would be my future room was the very same black figure she had seen in my crib, but this time it was smiling and looking right at her. She freaked out and ran back to my dad. He didn't believe her, but every night when she had to go to the bathroom she'd make him come with her. After that, whenever I'd start to stir or cry, she'd pick me up straight away and hardly ever put me back in my cot. She told me that every time she attempted to, she'd see it again, just sitting in the corner smiling down at me. She said it was more than a shadow. She said it was completely black and all she could see of it was the whites of its eyes and big smile. She only told me this story after I moved out of my room upstairs. Apparently when I was about 3 or 4, she was sitting on the bottom of the stairs when I came up to her and asked Mummy, "What happened to the little boy?" "What little boy?" she asked. And I said, "The one that used to sit in my bed." I have no recollection of this exchange, which is odd for me because I can recall entire conversations word for word from up to 18 years ago. I'm only 20 now. A couple of years later when we went to visit family in Fiji, she told her father about it and he just sat there with a look of distress and concern on his face. He told her, "Sweetie, that sounds like the same thing I used to see when I was a boy." And that's when he told her about the black figure of the little boy in the tree outside his window. From being around the age of 3, I have always had the luxury of witnessing the paranormal. I say luxury, but I could rephrase that. I would say it started when I would supposedly speak to a middle-aged woman who would sit at the end of my bed each night along with her rather large, white-haired dog. Apparently, we would talk for hours on end. My parents were well aware of her presence but never told me to hush, considering she would always send me off to sleep. I was told years later that she was my dad's mom, my grandma, who died in '89 from Hodgkin's disease, and her dog, the Newfoundland by the name of Ralph. Getting a little older now, and my house had been redecorated, meaning I got the bigger bedroom, as I was the eldest daughter out of 4 brothers and a sister. I was over the moon to say the least. That didn't last for long. That bedroom gave me the worst nights I can recall so far of the 15 years I have lived. It is only now that I realize that is why my parents converted the house, to get out of that room. My first experience in that room was when I was around the age of 9. I had an awful nightmare, which had consisted of me being locked in a shop, that had all the lights off and the shutters were down. I rattled the shutters again and again, crying out for help, only to wake up and see a face on the ceiling smiling at me. In order to ignore it, I turned onto my side. However, in my room there was a staircase that led to my parents' room, and under those stairs, there was a further extension in the wall, where I usually dumped my teddies. On this occasion, I saw a black figure standing in that extension. I screamed for help, which resulted in me not sleeping in there for quite a while. Fast forward a couple of years and we had moved house. Unfortunately for me, I had to share a room with my sister, which was bad news to hear. For the first few months, nothing out of the ordinary happened, only a few bumps in the night where an object would fall off a shelf, which we would excuse as the wind. Then, the night before my 11th birthday, I had woken around 2 in the morning with a feeling of being watched. When I looked to the corner of the room, I saw a woman, with long curly black hair, dressed like she had belonged to the 80s, standing there, looking at me. Of course, I froze, but didn't feel malicious or like I had from the face on the wall in my old house. Soon after, she disappeared. Once again, I found out that woman was my grandma, as my dad had described her to wear a pink cardigan when she was alive, which is what she wore when I saw her. After that, it was the same routine of things falling off shelves and me waking up around 4:30 every morning, which were all dismissed as just simple occurrences that were not to be taken notice of. Now 4 years on and things have started up again. My mum has woke up with the feeling of being held down, unable to breathe, while seeing a dark black figure peering into her room. After a while, it stopped, but is now unable to sleep without the light on. She has also stated that while I am at school and she is alone in the house, she will hear heavy coughing come from my room, of which sounds like a little girl, which I have heard myself when I have been alone in my house as well. I am well aware this sounds very far-fetched, but even my parents have stated that growing up, they have witnessed these sorts of occurrences. It's a shame that I'm the only one out of all my parents' 6 children to be able to see what I can, but it makes life all that more exciting.